Hi folks, my name is Matt Sisko, and I'm the Mayor of St. Catharines. Today I brought together a group of leaders from our local Indigenous community to have an open, honest, and at times challenging conversation centered around truth and reconciliation. The timing for this, I think, is just about perfect. Today is September the 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day to honor the lost, survivors, the children of residential schools, their families, and their communities. I come to this debate maybe from a different place from a lot of people. I can look back at who I was 10 years ago and recognize that my viewpoint when it comes to talking about Indigenous relations is very different now than it was. Like many of the people who are watching this right now, I grew up and went to school. I learned what we consider to be the traditional viewpoint of what history looks like. And I lived in a society that carried a lot of the same biases, a lot of the same prejudices that have existed for so long in this country. I also didn't learn a lot about the perspective of history from the Indigenous side of the conversation. Over the last 10 years, I've been blessed to be able to have conversations with, make friends with, start to really understand just how one-sided the view that was presented to me and to those like me actually was. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of educating of myself. I've spent a lot of time trying to read and to learn and to understand the other perspectives that exist about what history looked like on this continent, not just from the perspective of the people who settled it, but from the people who were here before us. And I felt like doing something like this was important. I've been very blessed in my life. I've had a lot of opportunities for that growth, and not everybody has those opportunities the same way I have. In the last year, I've been very blessed to become the mayor of the city of St. Catharines, and in that time, I've been able to build upon the work from my predecessor, Walter Senzik, in developing and strengthening relationships with the local Indigenous community here in St. Catharines and Niagara, specifically the Niagara Regional Native Center. So I've had the opportunity to have more conversations, to educate myself more, and I have access to people and to ideas that many in our community may not have immediate access to. In 2018, the City of St. Catharines signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the Niagara Regional Native Center. And that was created and developed in the spirit of truth and reconciliation to try and reduce the barriers when we're planning Indigenous activities, to increase the awareness and the education around Indigenous issues and history and culture, to encourage community engagement and gathering, support the Indigenous community and foster diversity, equity, and inclusion, guiding and advising city staff to ensure that respectful and appropriate representation of Indigenous culture happens in the city of St. Catharines. Making sure that the MOU is maintained and it's strengthened is vital to the city. The NRNC and the community have responded very positively to these steps that we've taken, but there continues to be more we need to do. But right now we have a solid foundation for building strong relationships with the Indigenous community, and that's a first step in the road. As I said, when I took office in the late parts of 2022, myself and my office met with members of the NRNC and reaffirmed our commitment to strengthen and maintain the relationship we have with the Indigenous community. Now, before I introduce my guests, we're going to have a panel discussion and talk about some of the issues that are relevant today, some of the issues that are relevant in St. Catharines and Niagara. Before I introduce my guests, though, you might be wondering where I'm sitting. This is a special place here in downtown St. Catharines. One of our best corporate citizens, one of our biggest employers in the city, Accenture, located right in the heart of the downtown, has generously offered space in their building to be able to film this discussion. So I'm joined by Fernanda Luna. Fernanda is the Indigenous Peoples Employee Resource Lead here at Accenture. Fernanda, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit and tell everyone a little bit about this space.
Yeah, absolutely. So this space is actually called the Legacy Space. We actually launched this space in 2022 for the Canada Summer Games. We were the inclusion and diversity sponsor during this year, so we actually launched the space during that time, and we actually renamed the space to Mwaji Itiwag, which actually means to come together or to gather in one place, which is really what we're doing here today to talk about, truth and reconciliation. The goal with these spaces is really just to bring awareness, tell the Downey Wenjack story, which is who we're partnered with right now to put these spaces in place, and showcase local art. We actually had a local artist, Clayton Samuel King, who put together these wonderful murals and paintings of these different teachings. This mural actually represents the 7 teachings, the 7 grandfather teachings. And you can see he actually painted each animal in a different color, and the little boy who was actually guided back home with all these teachings by the otter. And also these light fixtures over here that have the 5 council fires that are local here for our region. So we're just really excited to have you guys here to be able to see the space and utilize it and really be able to continue telling the story.
Well, I appreciate you giving us a little bit of perspective on the space, and I appreciate the work that you and Accenture have done to try and forge those links within the community.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, we all have the opportunity to build the community we want, and I think you've done an excellent job with that here. Right after the break, we'll be back with our panel discussion, and we'll be able to delve into some of the issues that folks like you have sent into my office and to the folks who are involved. So stick with us, and we'll be back right after the break. Folks, welcome back to our special today on the Day for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm joined by a couple of fantastic human beings, people that I've gotten to know over my time as the mayor, and even before that, in some instances, seeing their leadership throughout the community. I'll start off with my good friend Dawn. Dawn is one of the executive directors at the Niagara Regional Native Center, and joined on the top row with Dawn is Jess. Jess is also one of the executive directors at the Niagara Regional Native Center. Now, ladies, we came to know each other through that first initial meeting that I had with leadership at the NRNC. We had some good conversations about what the Memorandum of Understanding looks like. I was wondering if you could sort of expand on that. What is the NRNC for the folks in the community that don't necessarily have a good understanding of it? And what's the purpose of the MOU between the city and the NRNC from your perspective?
Okay, so what the NRNC is, so we are a non-for-profit organization. We are a social service agency. We service everybody in the community from cradle to grave. We don't just service Indigenous people, we service all kinds of people. But we do things, we have like a lifelong care program that helps with our seniors. We have a multitude of children's programs, youth programs. We do pretty much anything that's needed by community. Our staff comes together and figures out a way to get it done and to help out. And that's basically what we do. We're a support system for our community, specifically our Indigenous community, but we service everybody. But we're there to support in whatever's needed and whatever's asked of us, we try to make happen. And we usually do. We got a pretty good crew, a pretty good staff that knows how to get things done.
I've noticed that. Jess, I know you work within the legal sector, and you run an Indigenous justice program. Could you expand a little bit about that?
So the community justice program that we have at NRNC has a much larger catchment area than NRNC, so we service everybody from Niagara, all of the Niagara region, Hamilton, Wentworth, Brantford, Brant, and 4 different friendship centers, right? So Fort Erie Friendship Center, Hamilton Regional Indian Center, and Brisk, including our center as well. We've been running for 24 years, so next year we'll be celebrating our 25th anniversary. We were one of the core community justice programs that came about in 1999, and it was the vision of one of our court workers, Jean Wilson, who brought the program to Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centers, and now it's like 6 different areas in Ontario that have the program, and with our center, we're expanding the program. We were only 3 fires at one time. Now we're 4 friendship centers. But we service anybody from 12 and up who come in contact with the law. So pre-charge, which means they're not charged yet, and it's usually youth that come in that way, or post-charge. Anybody that comes in through the court system, we will work with them.
So I had the opportunity to come and sit with you for a day at the courthouse here in St. Catharines, and I've got to say, as a non-legal person, and I'm not, I like to pretend, I play a lawyer on TV sometimes, I'm not actually one, There's a lot of moving parts going on in a courtroom, and I would imagine, just based on what I witnessed, that you're a major resource for some of the people that are coming in, that maybe this is their first
am,
interaction.
yeah.
I mean, could you talk a little bit about that?
So my counterparts at the courthouse, they reference me as the lead representative for the Niagara court system. And it's something that I feel honored to have, right? And when we go into Indigenous Peoples Court or Indigenous Bail Court, I get to orchestrate what happens that day. And as you were there, you saw me up representing anybody that came in contact with us, right? Like my clients. So it's a big gift that I have, and I'm glad to be able to share it with the community, and I'm glad to educate the non-Indigenous partners that we have and come together and have this great partnership that we do. And it's great because other communities are seeing that and asking me to come to their community to work with their justice team, right? So it's just an amazing program that I'm grateful to be a part of.
And the conversation we had that day talking about, one of the big things in the court system is always, well, what's the recidivism rate look like? And the thing that I think is most eye-opening is, getting to know more about the program you're running.
Yeah.
You have better results.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you are helping people, that have had an interaction with the law not have continued interactions with the law. And that, to me, that should be the ultimate goal of the court system in general, not just, when dealing with, the Indigenous community.
Because we're not only dealing with just their legal matters, right? We're looking at the individual as a whole. So we're providing a holistic wraparound approach.
Yeah.
And if they need to seek employment, we'll help them with that. If they need mental health support, we'll help them with that. So we're providing this holistic wraparound approach with them. But culture is one of the key components of reducing that recidivism rate, right? So that cultural attachment, bringing them back home, allowing them to have that sense of community again, because a lot of people don't know where they're from. So when we provide that to them, it's a great thing just to see from where they started to where they finish. It's an amazing. I still remember my very first successful case, and I actually just seen him a couple of days ago, and he's still doing amazing.
Awesome. We could talk for a long time just about that one program. The third member of my panel right now is Fallon. And Fallon, I've watched you over the last couple of years. I think all of you are forces of nature, but Fallon, I've watched you through, I think, a partnership with my predecessor, Walter, bring issues to the forefront. You did the Red Dress Walk, more recently the Search the Landfill rally that we had at City Hall. Talk a little bit about what brings you to those issues and makes you want to put more focus on them within the community, because it's a piece that's been missing from our community conversation for so long, and it's becoming much more directed, and that's a positive thing. But what brought you to that?
The children brought me to that. I really think I became more involved with the community when myself and my kids were with me. We were all together, like I'm sure many folks were, when it was announced at the graves of Kamloops. And right away we didn't know what to do, but we saw across the nation people were bringing shoes to churches, and I thought, that's not a place where I want to go. And I thought, okay, City Hall, like, who can help us with this? And I didn't have a relationship with the Friendship Center at that point. And I put the shoes there, and if Carl was here, he would say, he didn't even know who I was. I mean, I knew who many of the community members were, but I wasn't connected yet at that point. And so I just had that realization in the last year, is that they spoke to many folks, and in a sense brought me to this community here, and I get really overwhelmed thinking about it.
No, I will say that was actually one of my turning points. I think I talked a little bit in the opening about trying to learn and trying to understand, and realizing that the perspective I had started with was one which was very much, government top down. This is what you will learn. This is the history. And I remember sitting on the bench in front of St. Catharines City Hall with Walter, and there were shoes lined up on the steps. And we sat there and we watched a couple of young fellas, older brother, maybe 13, and then 2 younger brothers, and they came over with shoes. And there was nobody else around. And they put the shoes down, and the older brother talked to the younger brothers. And they just stood there for a second, and they looked at it. And then Walter and I watched them walk away. And we had been talking. I don't even remember what we were talking about. But we both stopped and we watched this. And when they walked away, we probably just sat there for about 30 seconds. And then he looked at me and he goes, I don't even know what to do now. And I hope that the events of the last couple of years have caused people to start to think about things and understand that what they believe to be the reality isn't the reality. And I think that's the hardest thing for me. I read, and I've taken your book recommendations a couple of times, and I'm trying to gain this different perspective. And I've started to come to the realization that, the task in front of us to shift the lens that people are viewing things through is difficult, and search the landfill is an example. This is a conversation that everybody should be having nationally, but I don't feel like we're there yet. I mean, and you helped to organize the rally at City Hall. What's been the response of the broader community? The Indigenous community definitely showed up, but what's been the response from the broader community?
So with Search the Landfill, I mean, even for me coming into the community here, I want to acknowledge I had my community back home, and I had testified already at that point for the National Inquiry and had started advocacy within MMIW, but then, getting a whole understanding of really my story and how I even came to be there, that I was the girl. I mean, I was in it and I didn't even know. And so I think at the time of the nation talking about the final report and the calls for justice and then the inquiry, it had all kinds of attention. And right now, Search the Landfill, I think because it's so divided, you have leaders who are just blatantly saying no, when there has been a feasibility study done. And there are ways around to ensure that the folks who do search the landfill are safe. What they're saying isn't actually fact. And so for me, it's really upsetting. Just yesterday hearing on the news that there is still a divide in Manitoba itself. There's 48% and 50%. And it depends on where you are as well in the province. And you have to remember there's a high Indigenous population there. So to even have that kind of divide there, I can't imagine being there and witnessing some of the things that the folks there are witnessing, right? We're almost in a bubble here because we're away from the landfills. And I think that's also a part of the issue, is that it's not necessarily being spread around. And now we have, for someone who's on social media, we have issues because this isn't being talked about or shared because media can't be shared openly on social media. So I think that's also putting a stop on information being sent around and being able to be spread. And I think what folks need right now are the stories from the people, right? And one of the daughters is out there speaking. She was just in Niagara Falls this past weekend. And so you have to hear those stories. I think people need to hear those stories and understand that those are people's children and daughters and mothers in those landfills, and they deserve the same respect that if it was a politician's child.
So you talked about the split in Manitoba. When we look in Niagara, and I know that there's the Niagara Regional Native Center and then the Fort Erie Native Friendship Center in the southern tier. The advocacy work that you're doing, do you see that split here as well? Is it as well defined, like public opinions about these issues related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, to the calls for the 94 calls to action, do you have the same split in the population when you go out and you do that advocacy work, or does it seem to coalesce in one direction or another? Anybody can answer that one.
What'd you say?
I mean, realistically and honestly, we'll always see it. We'll always see it because it's there.
Yeah.
It's there, and it's I don't think probably, I would hope that it's going to go away in my lifetime, but I mean, that's one of the huge reasons that I got into doing what I do. Not as an executive director, but I started out in front line, was to build those relationships with other organizations, and so it's not so divided, to work alongside them instead of against them all the time. And we've developed, relationships with our local family and children's service agencies and that kind of thing to build those so that we can service our people better. But yes, if you're asking for my honest, yes, I see it every day.
Have you seen a change in the broader public's views on these issues, or does it feel like it's still stuck in the past?
It's both. It's both. So the more that we do get our voices heard and sharing time with the likes of you and people that we can be heard, then yeah, it does elevate it to where we're a little bit more heard and a little bit more understood, and people hear what we're saying. But you always still have those people who don't want to hear what we're saying and don't believe and don't, yeah. It's a tough gig.
I can only imagine.
Yep.
So with that said then, how big of a change do we need to make at the public policy level, or continue to make, to start fixing this? I mean, my personal opinion over the last couple of years has developed to the point I think we need a complete revamp of Canadian history curriculums. We need to start teaching early exactly what the history of this country is, and we have to start teaching it from multiple different perspectives, because I think if you don't get all of them, you can't build a more complete idea of what happened. But beyond that, what are the other things that need to be done from a public policy perspective to help to start change those attitudes in the broader community?
I think if we have the Truth and Reconciliation, we've got 94 calls to action, but we have other legislation or other things that are just sitting on a shelf, right, in the past.
Yeah.
And it's just sitting there. So all of these recommendations have been given, but they're just sitting on a shelf. And that's what's happening with the TRC as well, right? It's just sitting there. So for me, on the legal standpoint of things, working in justice, I hear it when I'm at other communities and I'm trying to, help them get Indigenous Peoples Court or stuff like that. I'm a very observant person, and that's what I like to do, is I observe people first before I speak. And for one instance, at one community that I was at, I was, we're eating lunch and I was observing people and I was listening to people, and somebody just kept saying, "This is not going to work, this is not going to work." And I thought, okay, I'm going to address it. So in the afternoon, when I gave my presentation, I presented all afternoon for like 3 hours. And I made sure that I addressed what I heard, but I didn't point the person out, Yeah, you're right, it might work here, but it might not work at your place, but there's ways that we can have it work, right? So, I don't know, I think it's, we need to have reconciliation instead of reconciliation, because nothing's being done, right? There's little small steps happening, but reality is it's still sitting on that shelf.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the 94 calls to action, and we're going to have a conversation about that and a number of other things when we get on the other side of the break. But I appreciate you bringing it up. I know in my office, in preparation for this, we decided to go online and find out, well, if there's 94, how many of them have we hit? And there are tracker websites that will tell you that we haven't hit many of them. But that'll be a part of the conversation when we come back after the break. So folks, stick with us. After the break, we'll continue the panel discussion, and we'll get into a whole bunch of questions that have been submitted from residents about things they want to know, and questions that my friends on the panel will be willing to answer. Right back after the break. Welcome back. We are here for a continuation of the panel discussion. In the next, this segment, we're going to be talking about a bunch of questions that have been sent in. I'm going to explain the concept, but first I want to introduce a new panelist, which has just appeared. We've shuffled things around. This is Sean Vanderklis. Sean is one of the co-hosts of One Dish, One Mic, and it has become a great resource for me over the last couple of years, and the person who says, hey, if you ever have a stupid question, feel free to text. And I raised that because Sean had a great idea for today, and we put it into practice. He suggested doing an Ask Me Anything style segment where we go out into the community and we ask people to fire off questions. So we did that. We went onto social media, we went onto Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and also Reddit, and got a whole bunch of questions collected from the community. And when the suggestion was made, I said, we're probably going to get some ignorant questions. And what did you say, Sean?
Ignorance is just the preliminary steps to racism. So the best way to combat racism is with education, right? Yeah. People ask these things simply because they don't know. It's a lack of knowledge. So by creating a safe environment, by creating a safe space, providing people the opportunity to ask these types of questions, you get to nip racism in the butt.
And so we said, okay, we're going to throw a couple of those questions out, and the panel has the ability to answer them as best they can. So before the break, we were talking about the 94 calls to action, and we were discussing how few of them have actually been completed. So how many of the 94 calls to action have actually been worked on and completed to this point? 13. So we actually had that conversation in the break. Yeah. 13 calls to action. The question that came through, the big part of the question was, if the 94 calls to action were completed, is reconciliation satisfied? Have we reconciled at that point, or is reconciliation a more indefinite concept, has to continuously be worked on?
In my opinion, reconciliation should be an ongoing process, right? Despite the Truth and Reconciliation Commission being issued and the calls to actions being issued, there are still community members who are dealing with the truth aspect of this, right? There's truth and reconciliation. And there are examples that are near Six Nations where there's the Save the Evidence campaign, where the federal government is still actively trying to destroy evidence that happened, right? Indigenous people are still dealing with this, and I don't think it's fair for any person who's not of Indigenous background to tell us when it's time for us to get over something, or to move on from something, or to say something's reconciled. 13 calls have been actively completed. There are several more. I want to say it's in the 30s or 40s that are ongoing. This government's the first government to ever have a roadmap to reconciliation, right? How are you going to deal with Indigenous people? Well, you have 94 ways you could do it. And they've only done 13 in the last 7 years, so it's kind of embarrassing.
I would argue that it's shameful as opposed to embarrassing, because, you know, the conversation we had as a group, I put this out to family members, and I, you know, in these discussions and talking about, oh, well, it'd be so difficult to do it. And have you ever read the calls to action? Because it's only about 6 pages. Yeah. They're easy to find. You type in the words in the Google and it'll spit it out, and you can read it and have maybe the same epiphany that I had. These are pretty reasonable.
2 of the calls that are completed are, one is an increase in funding to the CBC to promote Indigenous programs. They were doing that anyways, right? That is easy. That should have been day one. The second is an increase in funding to the Aboriginal People's Television Network. Again, already doing. So in reality, they're probably at like 4 or 5 completed calls that require a little more thought, a little more intent, and a little more money. So again, it's kind of embarrassing.
Well, declaring Truth and Reconciliation Day is one of the calls, and I think land acknowledgements are a part of the calls to action. Are they not?
No.
Well, then let's bring that up. Land acknowledgements.
Yes.
So we do land acknowledgements regularly. And we do them before every civic ceremony, everything that we are doing through City Hall. Most government institutions, a lot of private institutions are doing land acknowledgements. I hear a lot of mixed things, and I'm starting to hear more mixed things about the reception that people have for the land acknowledgement, the actual contents of the land acknowledgement. I know I've sat through, mispronunciations during the land acknowledgement. How do you feel land acknowledgements should be performed, if they should be performed, and what do we need to change about them?
So I know for us, we do get a lot of calls asking us to come and do land acknowledgements for events and things like that, and that's not ours to do. I know where I am, right? I know, I don't mind. We don't accommodate, but I'll help them find where they need to look to find a land acknowledgement. What I would like to see more, and I'm not promoting land acknowledgements by any means, but from the aspect of the business and the work that I do, what I would like to see more is, if you're going to call me to ask me to come and do a land acknowledgement for you, and I explain to you that that's your role to do, it's not mine, ask me how to pronounce some of these words so that you're not standing up there fumbling and mispronouncing it, because that I can help you with. But I don't ever get that until it's the moment of, and then they look around for the brown one in the room to, how do I say that, but it's the truth. That's what they should be asking. Educate yourself on those things, and I'll help you with it.
So one of the things that I learned a couple of years ago was that if I'm doing a land acknowledgement, I should make it personal to a certain extent, that I should be talking about what I've learned with respect to the land that I'm standing on, and the peoples who have been here for generations and generations before anybody who looked like me was here. How important is that? Because most of the land acknowledgements we hear are exactly the same every single time. So is that personal piece important?
I think so. If you're going to do it, there needs to be a connection. It's how we all work and live in this life, and in a good way, it's through being connected. So if you are going to do it, come from it from a place of knowing your role and your history and the way you want to move forward as well after learning what you've learned, right? I understand that there's always, people need to learn. Like I'm very much with you. It needs to be an open dialogue, because otherwise people will feel ashamed and they won't move forward. I think we're at the point now that no one should be calling Dawn and asking her to come and do a land acknowledgement. I think she's being very kind by even telling folks that she won't come out, because I think we're far past that, asking, like she said, about pronunciation, and maybe wanting to learn more about the land because you're coming from it from a place of wanting to connect and care and understanding. Those questions, I think, could be met with some openness and dialogue and conversation, but I don't necessarily agree with where we're at the point where people are still asking that, as non-Indigenous folks asking Indigenous folks to be doing it.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I didn't realize people were still calling and asking if you would come and do the land acknowledgement, and that kind of blows my mind a little bit. Yeah. Are they still meaningful?
They can be, right? Like the way I interpret land acknowledgements is it's an exercise. It's the opportunity for people to participate in an exercise that provides them some context into who we are as a nation, right? So in Niagara, we have two major First Nations groups. We have the Haudenosaunee. We have, I guess it would be 7 different First Nations groups. My apologies. So 7 different First Nations groups plus the Anishinaabe people, right? So taking the time to be able to list all 7, right? If you're going to sit here and say, I would like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Haudenosaunee people, well, who are the Haudenosaunee people? Can you say Haudenosaunee, right? Who are the Mississaugas? Who are the Anishinaabe, right? Because I'm throwing all these terms together, but do you actually know who they are? Mm-hmm. And as an educator, because you're a teacher, I mean, this is a perfect opportunity for teachers to bring this to the students. Well, tell us who the Haudenosaunee people are, right? Whose land was it? What treaties are here, right? And it just the goal of it is to spark curiosity, but the goal of it is also to find commonality, right? When it comes down to it, if you don't do that work, like that's what I'm looking for, is those moments of embarrassment where city councilors get up there and like, I'd like to acknowledge the Haudenosaunee or the Anishinaabe, right? Just simply because they haven't done the work. And they should feel that embarrassment. They really should, because the land acknowledgement in St. Catharines and the Niagara region has been the same for like 4 or 5 years. And if you're a second-term councillor, that means you've gone a whole term without even taking the time to learn that land acknowledgement. So I know there's a couple councillors that you deal with who don't even know how to say Haudenosaunee.
And I would never call out any of my colleagues. But it was definitely like, that was a thing that I felt was important for me. I have to figure out how to say these properly. And getting back to that personal piece, it was one of the things that I would like to institute with our council is, if you're in charge of doing the land acknowledgement, here's a brief templated version, but you have to add something. Because I feel like if you have to add something, you're going to put the effort in to make sure you don't sound ridiculous. So you're going to educate yourself. And I wonder if maybe that's one of the things that we need to do to make these less performative and make them more meaningful, not just for the person who's reading the land acknowledgement, but for the people who are listening. Because one of my other concerns, we use the land acknowledgement in so many places, and at least from a City of St. Catharines perspective, it's always the same land acknowledgement, that it just becomes background noise. It's the thing that we do before the anthem, and that's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it is, I think, very important to recognize, because if you're recognizing who's been here on the land forever, then you're recognizing, I think, that the history as it was taught in school is different from the actual history of the land. It's forcing a recognition of what actually took place here. So, and this is why I think land acknowledgements could be a force for good, but I think we have to make some pretty big changes. And you've provided a bunch of context, you all have, about how to make those changes. I think that hopefully can guide a lot of us when we're trying to do land acknowledgements in the future.
I challenge you saying too, having a template. You don't need a template. They can do it on their own. They can find those words.
And as I was saying the words "have a template," I thought, no, actually that's the exact opposite of what you want to do. But I also believe, it's the teacher in me, guided direction as to how to do it. Maybe not providing a template, but providing some key facts that hopefully will spawn a little bit of an education session on their own, right?
Yeah.
So when it comes to issues around Indigenous sovereignty, and specifically the concept of land back, which I think a lot of people have heard, but I don't think a lot of people understand, the question is, how do the concepts of Indigenous sovereignty and land back apply to the Niagara region?
Give the land back? I mean, it's really that simple. Like in Canada, we have provincial lands, we have crown lands. That is held in trust for the Queen, which should be our land. It's really that simple. Give provincial parks back to the Indigenous people, right? I mean, we just saw what happened with Doug Ford in the Greenbelt, where he's actively selling off billions of dollars worth of land, right? Indigenous people have been the caretakers, have been the stewards of land since time immemorial. It should be rightfully returned to the land. If you look over the mountains into BC area, that is all unceded territory. And what unceded means in literal terms is stolen land. That's what it is. The BC government has no jurisdiction there, but they manage that land as if it's their own. There's no treaties that were ever signed in BC, right? And it's very similar here. Six Nations has never been defeated on any sort of battlefield or any sort of war whatsoever. But yet here they are still fighting. I'm pointing to my colleague over here because she's a member of the Six Nations Confederacy. But they've never been defeated at all, but they're still fighting for land back, right? We remember what happened in Caledonia. We remember what happened in 1492, Land Back Lane. It's really that simple. Give the land back. Sorry.
It's that simple. The other night I was reading an article talking about national parks, and how we try to celebrate the national park system. Part of Canada 150, there was a whole program where you could get a parks pass, and it was so inexpensive to go in, and this is Canadiana. And then the writer delved into the background behind those parks, and the fact that it's called Algonquin Park for a reason. People lived there. Those were those traditional territories, and the Canadian government forced them out. You know, if you go up to Banff, there were Indigenous peoples living there, making their life there for, you know, time immemorial, and we forced them out and created this gated system. And I think that's a perspective that a lot of Canadians have never even stopped to think about, because I know from my own personal perspective, until a few years ago, I hadn't thought about it. A provincial park is a beautiful place. A national park is a beautiful place. It's somewhere to go and enjoy wildlife. And you know, you never stop to think about the people that were stewarding the wildlife and stewarding the environment for so long. And then all of a sudden it needed protection, but it didn't really need protection. And that's a legacy of, you know, the racism that existed and has continued to exist for a very long time in Canada.
To interrupt you, it continues because it was just this summer that a Indigenous individual shared that they got to go into a park. It was not meant to go as viral as it did. It was just a video sharing that they were going into a park, and it was free for them because they're Indigenous, and they showed their status card, and racism was all through the comments because people were in an uproar that this individual got to go into the park for free. So it's very much an issue.
And, you know, so let's expand on that, because we did have a couple of questions. And they're questions that I personally have heard my whole life, you know, around the idea of taxes. So the question was, why do I have to pay taxes while Indigenous people do not?
You didn't have a good enough lawyer. I mean, it's really that simple. If we think about the history of treaties, a treaty is a negotiation. It's a contract between two governments. Our government may have won that, right? I mean, we also had to deal with hundreds of years of genocide and loss of language and the devastation of our women. But I guess that the only benefit would be the fact that we don't have to pay taxes. You also, if you go into a First Nation, and there is a bit of a misconception there too, that anybody who goes onto a First Nations community, it's tax-free. So if I were to go to Tim Hortons in Six Nations right now, you're not paying tax, right? Because there's no tax on reserve. It's not exclusive to Indigenous people. It's exclusive to the territory that you're on to. As people living in as First Nations people living in an urban environments, in a very specific circumstance, we could go to a Walmart and make a purchase and only pay a portion of that tax. But again, that's specific to First Nations, and that First Nations is 1/3 of the definition of Indigenous. So Fallon, my good friend over here, would not have the ability to do so.
And I think that's actually leads to another question that was raised that I don't have on my sheet, but this misunderstanding of exactly who the Indigenous people of Canada are, because I think a lot of people mistake Indigenous to mean First Nations.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. Indigenous means more than that.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about that? Because Fallon, you're Métis.
Yes.
And so that is a separate part of the Indigenous landscape in Canada,
Yeah.
like a separate grouping of people. What's your experience like when you have these conversations about indigeneity in Canada and people assume something that is not correct?
Well, for myself being Red River Métis, there's a whole other conversation that I have with folks as well. And the understanding, because a lot of folks think, if they do have this idea of what Métis is, they think that I am in the same, so to speak, bubble with First Nations or Inuit, and that is not. We, as a people, came to be because of the ethnogenesis. Our ethnogenesis of Métis people came to be because of first contact, and then First Nations folks coming together, or Inuit folks coming together as well. So, for me, I call home back in the Red River area, because as a Métis, I have ties back to the Red River area.
And then these are the things that I think a lot of Canadians just don't realize. They don't understand the differences between groups, and it's part of the reason why I wanted to do the special. So I appreciate, that insight.
Yeah, there's a misconception too,
Yeah.
to make it very clear. Just because you have an ancestor who is Indigenous and you have ancestors who are non-Indigenous, you are most certainly not Métis.
Yeah.
You have to have ties to the Red River area, and I have ancestors. My family is from there, and so you have to have those ties to the Red River area, and there's a lot of misconception around that as well. well. And so I always encourage people to educate themselves, because there are some people who don't know that.
Yeah.
And they need to go down that journey to understand that. If they're just going into it and making claims without really wanting to learn, then I think that in itself is problematic anyway, right? So
For sure.
Yeah, so like it's tough because the definition of Indigenous traces back to the repatriation of the Constitution, right? So 1982, they repatriated the Constitution, and they put in Section 35 of the Constitution, which outlines that Aboriginal people consist of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Under the umbrella term of First Nations, you have status Indians and non-status Indians. So all three of us back here are status Indians. Based on how we would have children and how we would carry on our family, we could lose that status. People often mistake non-status and Métis as the same thing, and they're completely different groups, right?
Yeah.
To be Métis is to stand in the act of oppression, right? The Métis people exist simply because they weren't accepted in First Nations communities. We said, Fallon, your skin is too fair, you don't belong with us. And then white people are like, Fallon, your skin is too dark, you don't belong with us. And so that's how they came to be, is their origin story is an act of resistance.
And these are the pieces that all of us need to do a better job of understanding. I'm going to finish up with symbolism. And I'm a big believer in the idea that, symbolism without action is not a waste, but I think symbolism needs to be rooted in some form of action that can take place. In St. Catharines, we have a statue on the front lawn of City Hall. It's the Private Watson statue, and it symbolizes a soldier who fought in 1885 in the Northwest Rebellion. And we've had many debates in recent years about taking that statue down. I raised at council, I'm bringing a motion forward again. I'd like to see the statue come down. I think it's important to remember history, so we will have something there that recognizes that there was a statue here and what it was, but also talks about the reasons why we're taking it down. Can you explain why this is important? Because sometimes I feel like when I'm having the conversation, people tell me I'm virtue signaling or I'm being woke. But there's a real reason why this statue shouldn't be there anymore, and that it's causing pain to people in the community. Can we expand a little bit on that?
The Battle of the Batoche and the execution of Louis Riel is one of the only times a member of government was formally executed by their government. It's really that simple, right? Shortly after the Battle of Batoche, Louis Riel was captured and he was hung. And that's what that looks like. When we go to downtown St. Catharines and we see that, we see an opportunity. We don't see an opportunity. My apologies. We see that pain and suffering from our Métis brothers and sisters, and as well as the other First Nations people who fought alongside them, right? Because what was happening at that time was it was a westward expansion. So before Via Rail and all the trains were happening, they were still trying to get Manitoba into the country of Canada, and that would not have been possible without Louis Riel and all of his contributions. So for him to then come back and actively fight against to prevent encroachment and prevent further loss of lands. He was greeted with war. He was greeted with the Northwest Mounted Police fighting him, and that's what we see, right? Thinking back to statues, like who do we honor in Canada? Like who historically have we honored, right? We've honored people who have made significant contributions, right? Love or hate Louis Riel, or not Louis Riel, or Sir John A. Macdonald. I can understand as a First Nations person why Canadians would want to honor Sir John A. Macdonald, right? He's founding father of Canada, first Prime Minister. Does anybody know Private Watson's first name?
And to that point, I've said, this statue was originally intended as a gravestone for somebody who died. It was co-opted and put on the front lawn of City Hall, and I come from the perspective of, can we put this man to rest? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not going to try and make any castigations of society in the 1800s. I don't need to do any of that to recognize that as a community we can choose what we decide to honor, and we can change our mind. And as society develops and we recognize that what happened in 1885 was wrong, we don't have to continue to have a monument on the front lawn of City Hall. as the mayor, I want every single member of my community to feel welcome at City Hall, to feel like that's a place they can come to. And it seems like a very easy step, a symbolic step, but one rooted with a little bit of action to try and continue to walk that path of reconciliation and say, this causes the local indigenous community pain. We want them to feel comfortable here on these grounds, and so we can make that change. So I appreciate the perspective, and I appreciate all of you for the discussion today, for answering all the questions that were on there, even if they weren't the most politically correct, we'll say, questions in the world. I appreciate it. We'll be back right after the break. Stick around. Welcome back, folks. I'm joined by Noden Buck here. We are going to be talking a little bit about an upcoming event in St. Catharines. Downtown St. Catharines, October 7th, 12 to 5 at the Meridian Center is the Niagara Regional Native Center's powwow. Noden, what's great about the powwow? Why are we celebrating? What does it mean to you?
Well, a powwow is a place where people come together to celebrate what they love to do and what their culture is to them. So I go to powwows because it makes me happy, and I dance for those who can no longer dance anymore. But yeah, thank you.
That's phenomenal, and I just want to say thank you for coming. So Noden's going to present, do a dance for us, followed by some singing and drumming from the folks behind me. This is my opportunity to exit stage right, but before I do that, I want to thank everybody who's been a part of the special today. I want to thank Noden for coming and presenting for us. I want to thank everybody, all the singers and drummers from the Niagara Regional Native Center. I want to thank Dawn Motton. I want to thank Jessica Riel-Johns. I want to thank Fallon Farinacci. I want to thank Sean Vanderklis for coming and answering questions and helping us on this Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This day was created for people in this country to understand the history of Canada, to better understand our responsibility, and to better understand what we can do as Canadians to work towards truth and reconciliation. So I hope you've taken something from this special today, and I hope you continue to do what I do, which is try to learn more each and every day. And with that, Noden, I turn it over to you.
Thank you.